Hello, I'm here again. I'm going to be taking you through another experiences from life. This is number 4. First of all, I'll share a précis of one of Morris's sermons, which was entitled Follow Me, The Cost of Discipleship, Part 3. And then I'll share my experiences of giving God rights. Jesus said some strange and perplexing things to his disciples. Take up your cross. People have different ideas of what this means, and they nearly always think that it's to do with circumstances. The lady with an unbelieving husband who ridicules her for her faith is convinced that he is her cross. The young man who works for a difficult boss who picks on him and is most unreasonable. Or the lady who's been crippled with arthritis for nearly 20 years and has never yet received the healing that she's begged God for. But none of these things are anything to do with the cross we have to take up. The cross can never be to do with our circumstances. Non-Christians have circumstances like these. They're common to mankind. If these things were crosses, then millions of non-Christians take them up daily. So we can't say our problems and burdens are the cross. Our cross is something quite different. Jesus said, take up your cross, which means it's a voluntary decision. We must start to change inside and do something positive outside. We have to voluntarily take up something God has placed before us, which our flesh does not want. We can't crucify ourselves. We can only take up our cross, place it across our back, and keep walking. God will do the crucifying when the time is right. You know, I've been in situations where God's placed something before me which has been repulsive to my flesh. But I've come to realise that kicking and screaming against God doesn't help. God doesn't pity the flesh. He destroys it. It's happened so many times that I've come to recognise that there must be a principle involved here. My family became Christians when I was only 9 years old, but I'm afraid the lifestyle which we led caused me to grow up to be a very rebellious, stubborn, quick-witted, sarcastic teenager. Not that I was aware then of my shortcomings. There always seemed to be some justifying reason why I didn't get along with people. After discharging myself from school at the age of 15, I taught my way into a clerical job, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I loved going out to work every day, and the idea of a wage and bonus at the end of the week proved an added incentive. I worked hard, and within only 2 months I was promoted to a position of supervisor over 2 women older than myself. Promotion must have gone to my head, as after only another 4 weeks had passed, I was told to do something quite menial by one of my superiors, which I adamantly refused to do. The next day I arrived at work and I was called into the boss's office. I was handed a wage packet and I was told that I was free to leave immediately. I was devastated and I wondered what had gone wrong. I really had enjoyed my work, but I'm afraid that when it came to female superiors telling me what to do, I just couldn't handle it. Well, my next few jobs were no different. They all ended up in the same way. I'd start off great, but then I'd end up being sacked for my rebellious attitude. And what seemed to make matters worse was the fact that people always knew that I was a Christian. From my very first day at work, people used to question me as to what I did in my spare time. And I told them I went to church, I was the organist, I sang in a church-based group. And this always used to open up conversation about God and the gospel. So, to end up being dismissed from my employment reflected badly on my Christianity and witness. And I felt that not only was I bringing disgrace on myself, but also on God. Many times I pleaded with God to change my character, but that was no use. I always ended up losing my temper and doing something which I regretted later on. And my problem was intensified by the fact that I used to live in a flat and I needed a regular income each week to pay the rent and the bills. And I knew that if something didn't happen soon to enable me to hold down a job, then I really would end up in trouble. It was at this point that I decided to join a bureau where people could take jobs on a temporary basis to cover for somebody in permanent employment who was either ill or on holiday. It meant that I'd stay in a firm no longer than 1, maybe 2 weeks at a time before I was moved into some other temporary position. Some of the jobs were good, others were not so good. But this wasn't really important because I didn't stay long enough to encounter any problems. Except one particular time when I was sent to an insurance company and put in a typing pool that was filled with women. And there was a woman supervisor to look after us. Well, our quota of work was to type 60 letters a day, which meant that we had to be swift, accurate typists. But often I had races with myself just to see how many letters I could complete. Sometimes I'd end up with 100 letters under my belt at the end of the day. My work capacity was recognised by the male bosses, and I was regularly asked if I'd become a permanent member of staff. I adamantly refused, time and time again. And the reason for this was because of that female supervisor who was over us. She didn't take to me one little bit and would always be looking for opportunities to find fault with me. Because I was there as a temporary employee, I used to ignore her snide remarks and think to myself, well, I may not be here next week. Other times I'd think, I don't work for this firm. I work for the bureau and she's got no real authority over me. But because of this change of attitude, I managed to hold down this job for a miraculous 9 months until a permanent person was found to take my place. I left this firm on good, friendly terms and was reassured that if ever I wanted a permanent job in the future, they'd accept me without question. You know, this success made me think. I knew without a shadow of a doubt that if I had been permanently employed there, I wouldn't have lasted 9 months at all, because there would have been a terrible confrontation between me and this woman supervisor at some stage. And from this point, my attitude completely changed. And I realised that I wasn't even working for the bureau. I was, in fact, working for God and should treat every situation of employment in this manner, whether I was permanent or temporary. A preacher friend of mine once said in a sermon, if you can't change your circumstances, then change your attitude. So, from then, I worked for many firms on a temporary basis and was able to witness for Jesus Christ without being disgracefully sacked. And every firm offered me permanent employment, which I refused, until I had the opportunity to work for an advertising agency. Now this was totally different to any employment which I'd been in so far. It was so exciting and vibrant. I came into contact with many famous people and was given the opportunity to model and do all sorts of things which I'd never dreamed I could become involved with. When I was asked to work for this firm on a permanent footing, I jumped at the chance. I never dreamed I could be so fulfilled. The people I worked with were not all in a mould as was usual in the ordinary run-of-the-mill office. But because of the nature of this business, they were all incredibly individual. The advertising agency was situated in this old detached house with 3 stories and basements where bedrooms and lounges had been converted into offices, and yet the original structure of the place had been kept intact. To get his inspiration, one of the ideas men, he used to sit in this big bath full of cold water in the hope that he'd come up with some weird and wonderful slogan for a new advertising campaign which would catch the eye and imagination of the public. The people here were so eccentric that it didn't matter what ideas they had, however bizarre or strange. Consequently, my Christianity was just accepted in the same manner as everybody else's weird lifestyle, and it was never taken as something that could possibly challenge them. I witnessed, and I prayed for a long time that God would use my testimony and lifestyle to speak to these people and bring them to Christ. But nothing happened. I must have been at this job for nearly 2 years when the minister of my church decided that he'd hold a crusade for the church members on the theme of the Sermon on the Mount. As I was the organist and worked very closely with the minister, he shared with me beforehand what his intentions were and stressed that it was important that we as the leadership ought to prepare ourselves for these meetings. I'd never fasted before, but I decided that I'd fast all day at work. Then I'd ride to the church on my bicycle and have something small and light before the service, save my main meal until I got home. For a whole month, I put the effort in. And as the crusade was meant to challenge the church, I reaped the benefit of that challenge and my whole life was devastated. I found that I wasn't thinking of the Sermon on the Mount only during the meetings, but God invaded my thoughts all day. And in the course of the month, I changed dramatically without even realising it. By the end of that month, I'd heard 24 sermons on the Sermon on the Mount. The pastor had preached it so thoroughly that he'd only got through the first 8 verses of Matthew chapter 5. So, I was left in no shadow of a doubt about what God intended that the characteristics of a Christian should be. And I also knew I didn't match up, hence the challenge. I suppose it was this realisation that caused all that soul-searching during the day. I knew I wasn't in the right place with God, but I didn't know what to do about it. But then, I needn't have worried. God had seen my efforts over the month with that fasting, and now He was doing things in my life that I could never have done on my own. I remember walking into the office of one of the director's secretaries one day to ask her something. We were just chatting in the normal way, when suddenly she stopped in her tracks, blushed, put a hand over her mouth and apologised for her foul language, saying, "I'm really sorry, Joanna. I didn't mean to say that in front of you." When I asked her what she meant, she said to me, really sincerely, "Well, you're holy, and I really didn't mean to say that, anything like that in front of you." I walked back to my office feeling really bewildered. I didn't know what had changed this girl's attitude. She was recognised as the most shocking, sexually explicit, crude and daring girl in the company, and that was really saying something amongst all these eccentric people. And yet she was apologising to me for her language. A week later, she and 3 of her close pals at work asked if they could come along to one of the meetings at the church, after which they told everybody in the firm how much they'd enjoyed it. A couple of weeks later, one of the bosses came. Then shortly afterwards, 2 other girls came, one of whom was a Catholic, and the other one, who'd been saved and filled with the Holy Ghost on her first visit to the church, continued to go on a regular basis. My life at work took on a whole new meaning as I began to hold prayer meetings and Bible studies during the lunch hours for those who were interested, until the time came when God told me to leave work and go full-time for Him in the ministry. I didn't realise when I made that little decision to deny myself meals for that month that it would have such an enormous effect on my life. At the time, I was doing it because I felt responsible for the meetings, and so I put effort in for the cause of the crusade. And yet God rewarded me personally. And this has happened so often in my life that I've come to recognise this is a principle. Accepting this lifestyle, practicing self-denial for the right reasons, provides God an opportunity to touch areas in our lives that He's never been able to get near before. God bless you.